Hey everyone, welcome back to Music Appreciation. Today we're looking at Chapter 51, Cottontail by Duke Ellington. So we are still here in the 20th century now, a couple decades in, and I want to set the scene a little bit, some kind of historical context before we listen to the piece. Duke Ellington's music comes out of a larger movement known as the Harlem Renaissance, which took place beginning in the 1920s and 30s in the Harlem neighborhood of New York City. So if you recall from looking at previous time periods here, the word Renaissance, remember, is the French word meaning rebirth or renewal. So it can refer to this time period about 1400 to 1600. But it can also be used to refer to renewals and interest of many other different types of arts during different time periods. So in this case, we're looking at the flowering of African American arts in New York during this time period. And this comes about because there's a large concentration of really incredible artists, sculptors, painters, writers, thinkers, musicians, who all end up in this kind of condensed area in New York, thanks to what was known as the Great Migration that happened right during this time period. And the Great Migration, I'll show you this picture right here, was not one single event. It happened over the course of many, many years. And this was a general migration of African Americans from the South moving upwards to the North. Most commonly, as you can see in this painting by Jacob Lawrence, most commonly they ended up in Chicago, New York, or St. Louis. So not coincidentally, each one of those three cities becomes a major center of jazz music. Today, of course, we're looking at New York. But this came about as a result of Jim Crow laws and regulations that were in place in the South during this time period, which were quite prejudicial towards African Americans. And really kind of held them as being in a lower class, a lower social standing. So the North didn't have such awful kind of regulations in place, so many African Americans moved up north. And so where jazz was really sort of born in the South, especially in New Orleans, by the time we reach the first couple decades of the 20th century, it's already migrated up north. So some other figures from this period you might be familiar with, the writers Zora Neale Hurston and Langston Hughes, the famous blues and jazz singer Billie Holiday, and then of course our artist for today, Duke Ellington. So here are a couple other portraits of life during this time period that came out of the Harlem Renaissance, some Ellis Wilson and William Johnson. So this painting right here from the year 1940 sets the scene of a couple. Looks like they're on a date in a cafe, maybe sharing some wine, and that kind of sets a nice context for our discussion about jazz music, because this is the type of context that one might actually hear this type of music being performed. And our piece for today, Cottontail, was written in this same year, 1940. All right, so what I'd like you to first do is to get the piece in your head, just to have sort of an idea of what we're listening for. So I'd ask you to go to My Lab through Pearson and listen to this piece. It's about 3 minutes long, pretty short, and pay particular attention to aspects of rhythm and texture. So Duke Ellington's Cottontail is an example of swing jazz. So what is it that makes it swing? Why do we call it that? What gives this movement, this music, some sort of movement or momentum? And also be thinking about texture. So consider ensemble, what instruments are playing, how many of them are there, see if you can kind of pick that out. And do they play different roles? So do we have some instruments that provide support while others provide more of the soloistic performance styles? Or do they trade back and forth? What's their relationship? So yes, I'd encourage you now to pause and listen to that. It's a pretty short piece, and then return here and we'll get some more context. All right, so I've mentioned jazz a couple times, and so I want to give you, it's a huge topic that we could spend an entire semester on, but a little bit of background about how swing is related to this overall movement. So jazz is a musical tradition rooted in African American culture. It comes partially out of this Harlem Renaissance up in the North, and it's often referred to by music historians today as being America's classical music, meaning this is a style of music that is unique to the United States. It was born in America out of American musical traditions, and eventually makes its way as an incredibly influential style of music all across the world. So whereas what we think of like the symphony orchestra in terms of classical music, that's really a transplant from Europe over to the US. So jazz is the US's kind of own unique contribution to music across the world. So jazz is a huge topic, and you can kind of think of it as being an umbrella that has many, many different styles underneath it. So today we're looking at an example of swing, which is a style of jazz, but of course there's also Dixieland, bebop, smooth jazz, cool jazz, hot jazz, lots of different styles. But we'll just cover one of them today. Even though there are so many different types, this entire genre of jazz is really sort of connected by these two basic traits here. We're familiar with syncopation and sort of rhythmic complexity. Of course, we've talked about that quite a bit, especially with Scott Joplin and his Maple Leaf Rag. But we haven't really seen much improvisation up until this point. And to improvise means to make something up on the spot without planning it out ahead of time. So you can improvise a speech, you could go see an improv group perform on stage in a theater, or you can improvise music. So improvisation becomes very, very central to the genre of jazz music, and we'll see some of that today with Duke Ellington. So looking more specifically at swing music, this is a style that was popular from about 1930 to 1945. And if you consider that time period, there really was a lot going on in the US and across the world. 1930, the US has just been hit by the Great Depression. Following just a few years after that, in 39 through 45, we enter into World War II. So there's a lot of tremendous social, political, and economic change happening during this time period. And I think a lot of people were drawn to swing as being probably the most popular genre of music during this time period because it's so upbeat and so danceable and lighthearted. And there were so many terrible things going on in the world, and I think people were really drawn to this kind of distraction, this lighthearted distraction that they could get through swing music. So this was the pop music of the 1930s, 1940s. So it's characterized by a particular ensemble known as a big band, and it's literally just a band that's kind of big. It's got about 10 people at least, at minimum, and lots of horns and winds. Show you a picture right here. They tend to perform in a bandstand, like with these kind of risers, often wear coordinated outfits. You have a band leader generally who stands at the front and is kind of the conductor of the group. A pretty good percussion section, usually a single string bass, but otherwise lots of brass and winds. You might also notice that they have music stands in front of them. So there are aspects of improvisation to swing music, but only partially. So each piece of swing music, taking Duke Ellington for example, Duke Ellington would write out a general composition, sort of a part that all the people would play in the group together. But then throughout the piece, the composition that they are reading off on music stands, occasionally a single person will stand up and play an improvised solo. So they'll sort of improvise on top of this overall composition happening. So there's a couple layers there. Some more context here about where this would have been heard. I've mentioned Harlem, of course. So there were two important swing clubs in Harlem during this time period, and that would be the Cotton Club and the Savoy Ballroom, both in Harlem. The Cotton Club was a little bit more upscale, but interestingly, even though most of the performers were black, only white patrons were allowed. Whereas the Savoy Ballroom, this is where the fun stuff actually happens, it was a very important swing venue, also a dance venue, and notable because it allowed mixed crowds. So both black and white patrons were allowed into the ballroom. So lots of great music, great dancing, and this is where you may have heard Duke Ellington if you were around in the 1940s. Here's a picture of dancers at the Savoy Ballroom, and swing is Our dance is central to swing. You really can't kind of disentangle the two of them. And of course, you've probably heard of swing dancing. And so this style really inspired a completely new style of dancing, sometimes referred to just as swing dancing, sometimes as the Lindy Hop. So I've included in our course, I'll pull it up here, in our course YouTube channel titled Music Appreciation, I have included examples of different styles of swing dancing, Lindy hopping, so I'd encourage you to check those out. Also a couple different styles of jazz music. All right, so turning to our piece for Chapter 51, Duke Ellington. Notice he was born 1899, the same year that Scott Joplin's Maple Leaf Rag was first published. So he came on like right at the tail end of the ragtime craze. Scott Joplin was not only a composer, but also a band leader and a really great pianist. So he's generally seen leading the band from his piano. And he's definitely the big name in swing from this time period. And as I mentioned, he performed at both of these famous clubs. So I would encourage you to listen to this again, and considering two aspects that are most important here would be harmony and rhythm, particularly rhythm here. I mentioned like considering where the term swing comes from, and it's because in one sense as you're dancing, you're swinging your partner around, literally lifting them into the air and swinging them in circles, but it also has to do with the way that rhythm is notated. So I've talked quite a bit about a straight beat versus a syncopated beat. So I'm going to play you just a really basic example here on my violin. So a straight, if you consider the straight eighths right here, they're on the beat and they emphasize the strong beats. So not particularly exciting in terms of rhythm, but one aspect of swing music is actually literally swinging the notes themselves. So even though they may be notated this way, it's inherent to the music. The musicians would know that you need to actually swing it, which is to produce a long, short, long, short, long, short rhythm. So something like this. And that already makes it a little bit more interesting. I'd also encourage you to pay attention as you're listening through for what's known as a walking bass. And this is a bass line that is plucked, so meaning the string is plucked with the right hand, as you can see happening here. And the bass player is providing this harmonic bass line that everyone else can build upon, ascending and descending scales in a very regular rhythmic pattern. So, for example, it might sound something like this. And that continuous pattern that never stops, just up and down, up and down. So two important aspects there to swing music. So please do take a listen again to it. Check out my playlist here that you can see a link to on our Blackboard site. I have examples. You can see a live performance of Duke Ellington playing Cottontail, an example of somebody demonstrating a walking bass, some examples of earlier styles of Southern New Orleans style jazz, and a couple other examples of Duke Ellington's music performed live, and also some Lindy hopping. All right, happy listening.